Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Ljubljana and to the Perennial Biennial Conference, which is a part of the Perennial Biennial project supported by the Creative Europe program. So, how to be a citizen of the world today is a question connected to the notion of cosmopolitanism, which has been increasingly criticized, mainly because of its moral universalism. Ljubljana Biennale, as a vast global show, far ahead of later post-colonial international exhibitions and biennials, was always proud of its cosmopolitanism. It was constructed on the modernist universalism, which was associated with the bold political ideology of socialist Yugoslavia and the pan-humanism of the non-aligned movement. Biennale was namely after 1961 also in line with Yugoslavia's official policy of non-alignment, whereas the biennial was a brand mark of Yugoslavia's open foreign policy, acting as an undeniably powerful ideological machine. But it was, last but not least, an art exhibition in the service of noble goals. It was an important meeting point of the East and the West, an open window into the world for the artist in the time of the Cold War. But one can also say that the noble goals are still a prevalent ingredient of the narratives in the international biennial domain. Biennial cosmopolitanism has been linked above all to post-colonial discourse and universal humanist values like equal opportunities for all, solidarity, hospitality, human rights, critique of global capitalism. At the same time, the idea of cosmopolitanism has often been criticized as a cover for enabling and spreading the same global liberalism. However, it is also evident that cosmopolitism as a standpoint gradually becomes more and more problematic, at least after Samuel Huntington's belief that the faith in the universality of Western values is nothing less than naive. Many contemporary thinkers believe that the idea of cosmopolitan democratic citizenship is institutionally and sociologically unachievable. There is a lack of the political capacity of cosmopolitanism. We often hear that cosmopolitanism takes the effects of globalization too seriously, and that democratic national citizenship has not yet lost its capacity. Moreover, national policies are playing an increasingly important role right now. Cosmopolitanism nowadays is seen as plural and post-universalistic notion. It is the time for the implication of alternative notion of cosmopolitanism, and we are all excited to listen to today's presentation and discussions. I would like to thank all the speakers for accepting the invitation in these challenging times. We will have lecturers here in person, Alia Swastika, Aljoša, Pužar, and Kostis Stafylakis, and online we will meet Sami, Daghistani, based in New York, Mahret, Ifeoma, Kupka, based in Frankfurt, and Joanne, Birnie, Danzker, based in Vancouver. I would also like to thank all the partners in the European project, Berlin Biennial, Liverpool Biennial, Riga Biennial, and Bergen Assembly. And now I would like to give the floor, before we start with the conference, to Stafylakis, director of the Liverpool Biennial of Contemporary Arts, and the lead partner of the EU-funded project. So, Sam, the floor is yours, and I will hand you this instructions.
Thank you. Thank you, Nevenka. And I'd just like to start by saying thank you for your hospitality to everybody here. It's wonderful to be here in the city, in person, finally together. And it's also thank you to everybody who's joining us online as well as on person too. It's great to have you here. The Perennial Biennial, as Nevenka mentioned, is a Creative Europe-funded project, and it's a partnership between Ljubljana Biennial of Graphic Arts, Liverpool Biennial, Bergen Assembly, Berlin Biennial for Contemporary Arts, and Riga International Biennial of Contemporary Art. And we collaborate too with the International Biennial Association. From 2018, we have been working together to explore sustainable models for perennial practice. We're supporting conferences, workshops of international thinkers and artists and curators, and we're also developing a new publication on local dialogues around international biennials. One of the strands of our work is a peer support and staff exchange network between each of our biennials. And I'm delighted to introduce Samira Huama, who's currently participating in one of these exchanges and is the moderator of our first session. She works in the mediations program of the Berlin Biennial, and she's also a writer and an art mediator and an art historian, and her practice is an ongoing search for the possibilities of decolonizing education within art through a poetic and visual sense of storytelling. And I'd also like to introduce Muanis Sinanovic, and I'm sure that I pronounced that wrongly, but please you correct me later. And he will be moderating the third panel of today as well. So thank you once again, everybody.
Hello. Is this on? Yeah? Yeah. Okay, good. Just checking. Thanks for the introduction. So my name is Samira Hualmia, and I'm here for staff exchange for the Berlin Biennial, and I would all like to give you a warm welcome again. I'm glad that we could be here today, physically present, most of you, in this very beautiful space called Švicarija in Ljubljana. And as we've heard, we have a little conference today. We have invited different speakers that will talk about their curatorial, their artistic, and their academic inputs towards new and critical approaches to cosmopolitanism. So we'll have 3 panel discussions with 2 speakers each. And yeah, as I said, because of COVID measurements, not everyone can be here today, but some of us are here with us digitally, and yeah, it's cool that it's working out. And this will all be streamed live and will be online in the end as well. So let's get started with our first panelist, Alia Swastika. Yeah, I would like to welcome you on stage, and yeah, thanks for being here. Welcome. I will give a little introduction about Alia Swastika's work. It's really cool that you're here today. I think you had the longest travels, I guess, from Indonesia. So Alia Swastika is a curator, a project manager, and a writer. And she's the director of the Georgia Biennial Foundation. I hope I also pronounced that kind of correctly.
Correct. Perfect.
Good. And her recent research deals with Indonesian women artists during the period of 1975 till 1990. So if you want, you can get started now, and we're happy to listen to your contribution.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you to Nevenka, Dusan, and Luca that you helped me so much with the visa application and all the other requirements we need for this time of traveling. So this is my first time international traveling in 2 years. So I have declined some other invitation, but when the email from Dusan came into my inbox, and then I thought that I decided to say yes, to accept, because I've heard so much about Ljubljana Graphic Biennale and the history and the importance of the Biennale in the Biennale making history. So yeah, I said, okay, let's give it a try to travel. And yeah, finally I'm here. So thank you very much again. And I think I want to let you know also that I just finished the Biennale Jogja last weekend. So we had 40 days of the exhibition offline happen, and there were lots of change because of the pandemic era. So I think I don't have the image of the current show in the PowerPoint, but we can go to the website later on. So yeah, like responding to the theme mentioned by Nevenka and also Sam on the idea of what is the meaning of becoming the world citizens today, my paper will be called, the title of the paper or the presentation is Cosmopolitanism from Below. So that's what I conclude somehow from my experience of working in the Biennale Jogja in Indonesia for 10 years. So this year actually we celebrate a decade of the Equator series of Biennale Jogja that we started from 2011. And Cosmopolitanism from Below somehow shaped the spirit of Biennale Jogja from how we see the idea of internationalism or being international or becoming part of the cultural diplomacy in the international world, not from the top-down approach from the government to the citizens or to the communities, but it's the other way around. It's the expression of the grassroots communities of the art world in Indonesia on how they define themselves as a member of international community. So this is the map of the world, of course, and this is how every time we started our conversation when, can I? So every time we started new edition, we have to look into the map to decide which country that we would like to work with, because the way we think about international art event is quite different. I'll give it later explanation, but in the middle you can see the equator, and Biennale Jogja for the last 10 years decide to work on the notion of equator as the big narrative or the big theme. And we define the equator, not only the equator lines, but it expands to the 23-degree below equator and 23-degree above equator. So this is the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn that becoming our geopolitical standpoint. And this is the, I put here the Tito part of the Bandung Conference in 1955. So actually Bandung Conference happened in Indonesia in Bandung 1955, become one of our biggest inspiration for the Equator Biennial, because at the time we think how we should introduce ourselves in the community of the art world, but at the same time we can offer something different, an alternative way to define internationalism. And we somehow inspired by how Bandung Conference in the period of the early 50s to 60s becoming one of the most important international diplomacy and political events. And that's kind of like becoming the contribution from the Indonesia to the world. So we want to have the same contribution on how we think about international art world at the moment. And the Jogja itself, this is like a bit of description of Jogja as a city. It's known as a student city in Indonesia because we have the oldest university in Indonesia, and the students coming from all over Indonesia. We have 17,000 islands in Indonesia, so it's quite diverse and geographically challenging. And most of the students or the young people outside Java, they wanted to come to Jogja to study there. But at the same time, we also have respected heritage site. We still have the king. So now politically we are led by a king, which is quite also problematic today. And at the same time, we face the problem of the gentrification of the city, where the traditions and all the local situated knowledge, they have to face the modern idea of developmentalism. So I think that's becoming one of the narratives that always being criticized and discussed every time we have the Biennale. So the question then, within that changing context of the city, how do we develop our Biennale? I want to give a bit of a glimpse on when I mentioned that actually the Biennale very much connected to the local community and also the notion of traditions. This is maybe will give you an idea how it works. No sound? Or not yet? Not yet, yeah? Oh, I think, okay.
Pada hujan yang berlebih, aku hanya
quite long, so I think half of that quite enough to show you the festivity and how the Biennale somehow expected to be the platform to, how the Biennale is expected to be the platform of institutionalization in the art world in Indonesia. Just to give you an idea that we don't really have the art museum, we don't have art institutions, so somehow the Biennale becoming the only institution that partly funded by the government, and somehow everyone have very high expectation for us to play the role of the museum, to play the role of alternative education, to play the role of regenerations, to play the role of like everything. So it's quite interesting how people see Biennale somehow as department store, maybe where you can find everything there. So I think this is also shows the arguments on how Equator series becoming important for us to develop our institution in the middle of the spirit of being international, of being part of the new cosmopolitan art world. We see the geopolitical parameter between the south and the north, which reflects the contrast of the wealth and territorial closeness. That is, we see the big gap between what happened in the Western cultural production and how we in other part of the world, we have to face the local situated knowledge in, with the situation we have in our local context. So the Equator series also give us the possibility to bring and to create dialogues with the countries who have similarities with the history of colonialism, with the history of the climate change, with the ecological problems today, because many of our country partners that work with us in the last 10 years, for example, we face one of the biggest problem of deforestations and also the erosion of the local education system. So by working in the Equator area, we find a new discovery that connects the culture of these countries with the Equator area to strengthen the solidarity. I think that's one of the highlight of our 10 years experiments, is how artists and curators in countries like Indonesia, India, Brazil, Nigeria, Southeast Asia, and for now we are working with Oceania, we found a platform to discuss the solidarity and how we see the global political situations and how we can contribute as curators and artists in the discussion of this gap of knowledge and resources. So I would like to give a glimpse of every edition. So the first Equator Biennale was started in 2011. That's when Indonesia meets India. So this is kind of like the first time that the Biennale claimed its position as international art events. And it's quite interesting because it's kind of revisiting our relationship with India. Indonesia and India used to be very close in the past, but then after the independence and the shifting of political situation in Indonesia in 1965, it's almost all the past relationship became disconnected because most of the new government at that time, the new order in Indonesia, the cultural policy, the foreign policy really much referring to the US and Europe. And this is also with the rise of new institutions like the Goethe Institute, British Council, Japan Foundations, and then French Institute and everything, then our idea of international artists then somehow shaped by these institutions, and we don't really much knowing about what happened in Africa, in other Asia countries or Latin America. So when we invited artists from India, it became very interesting kind of reunion because they see Indonesia as resemblance of India with the strong influence of Hinduism there. So this is some of the works exhibited during the Biennale. So I curated the first one with Suman Gopinath from India. So that's how it works also. Usually the foundation, we will choose one of the curators, the Indonesian curators, and then the Indonesian curators, they have the opportunity when for research in the country partners, and they have to decide their own curators partners. So this is also the way we want to deconstruct the structure of Biennale making, where usually it's a matchmaking where the directors or the foundations or the organizer, they always put up some curators together. Sometimes they don't know each other, they never had the experience to work each other, but for us it is important to hear the voice of the local curators of their partner, the future of their co-curators. So it's really like depending on who they wanted to work with. So that's another method that we tried to develop. And then in 2013, we worked with Arab countries, not a dead end. So it was curated by Agung Hujatnika and Sarah Rifki. This is also quite memorable because I think after 40, 50 years, we never have Arab artists coming to Indonesia, and we never think of what is Islamic art, contemporary Islamic art actually happening around the world. Because in Indonesia or in Jogja, when we think about Islamic art, people always think about calligraphy, people always think about the traditional form. So it was very interesting when the artists and the curators came and they give presentation and the creation of the world with the local community. Somehow it changed the stereotype of the idea of Arab world for the local inhabitants. And then the third one, we worked with Nigeria in 2015, Hacking Conflict with Jude Enokwi. And for us, this is also to commemorate BC Silva. So BC was part of the first person that we asked for all the suggestions and the construction of the concept and everything. We work very close with the Center of Contemporary Art in Lagos. So yeah, when we think about this edition of the Biennale, I always think about BC Silva and her contribution to the art world. And for us, this is one of the most successful collaboration, where most of the Nigerian artists who comes to Indonesia and created artworks there, they always feel like Yogyakarta or Indonesia is one of the most important moments for their creative life. I think there is the spirit that's directly connected between artists from Yogyakarta and from Lagos or other part of Nigeria, and the similarities of the context, not only on the history of colonialism, but also if you see the form of the arts, they are somehow very much connected, very much similar. And the idea of spirituality and other things is, I feel like this is one of the strongest collaboration we had. And then we had Indonesia meet Brazil in 2019, and then Indonesia with Southeast Asia in, Brazil was 2017, and then Southeast Asia in 2019. This is from the Southeast Asia. So after 10 years of working with Equator as a geopolitics notion, where we really base on the idea of geographical position, for this year exhibition, we have the archive exhibition to bring all the memories, to bring all the archive to be seen as a whole. And I asked this artist, this is a printmaking artist from Yogyakarta, to think about a new imagination of international world through making a new map. So instead of making the map that consists of oceans and lands and islands, he made the maps that constructed from art events or keywords or concept or philosophical theories. So this is more like the mind map of the world. So I think this is also giving us the new questions of, because we have to close, we already have the one full round of the first equator, and then now we are in the middle of questionings, what's next for us? How do we define equator for the next 10 years, for example, because we finished the first round. So for us, the next one maybe it's more looking into equator as imagination rather than geopolitical as physical things, but thinking about equator as the notion of how we look into different or other part of internationalism. So we don't really see the future of the Biennale really based on the making the new map again, but it's more going beyond physical map and creating new imagination. So one of the highlight as well for the archive exhibition is how we try to work, bringing the networks of the biennales in the global south as one strong connection. So we had working with Kochi Biennale in India, and then we work with Sharjah Biennale in Emirates, and then we work with Lagos Biennial in Nigeria, with Sao Paulo Biennial, and some of the biennales in Southeast Asia. And we try to create like a new archive collective that's showing the similar vision, because I believe our vision of this new internationalism and decolonization is not something only happening in Indonesia or in Jogja, but also becoming the vision of those other biennales. So I think, yeah, for us, this is some of the keywords and issues. So during 10 years of our exhibition, we find that artists always interested to the issues and discourse of water. Many of the country partners, they are constructed from the maritime culture. And then there is also the spirituality and belief that really connect us together, and then the urban disruptions, and then movement and activism. So this is like the 4 keywords that we find becoming the big questions for the artists and curators. And then I mentioned before, since now we have the pause, this is the time of us for asking the next direction of the Biennale. For us, it is always important to think the Biennale is an agora where all the artists, activists, citizens, the governments, and everyone who helped the city and the international world to shape its cultural platform to work together to look into something beyond art itself and think about the world as a place for us, as a playground for us to discuss and to meet together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alia, for this contribution. It was really interesting, and yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards, but before we have another panelist, so I would like to welcome Kostis Stafylakis on stage. Hello. Yeah, you have to, yeah. Hello, I'll shortly introduce you, and then maybe during that time you can do the setup. Kostis is a visual artist, an art theorist, and he also has a PhD in political science. And he has taught research-based art, art theory, and contemporary art at several universities. And he was also the curator of the 6th Athens Biennale Anti. Yeah, I'm happy that you're here today.
I'm so happy to find you here. Thanks, Amira. Many thanks to the Perennial Biennale for this fantastic invitation and the chance to discuss upon this extremely interesting and thorny issue. I have a presentation. We are about to find it. The title of the presentation is Against Goodness, Instituting Beyond Humanitarianism and Humanism. But I'm going to be good, so don't be afraid. Okay, so let me start with these. In July 2017, Iflux and Sternberg Press published the collective volume, What's Love, or Care, Intimacy, Warmth, Affection, Got to Do with It? Claiming that what we can no longer get from the state, the party, the union, the boss, we ask for from one another. The editors explain that it is often said that we no longer have an addressee for our political demands, but that's not true. We have each other. In September 2020, the Philadelphia Museum of Art hosted the Art and Care Show, an exhibition examining the ways artists over the last century have pictured and envisioned acts of caregiving as observers, practitioners, patients, and activists. As the exhibition blurb suggests, at a time when the stakes of such struggles are higher than ever, the pictures gathered here speak to the many forms of care that health, healing, and human dignity require. Also in September 2020, the Yale Macmillan Center opened Visual Acts of Radical Care, an exhibition of feminist artists, activists from Central and Eastern Europe. The show focused on Central and Eastern Europe, Europe's authoritarian regimes that silence artists, expel NGOs, and debilitate social movements, while striving to envision an allyship amongst ethically, racially, religiously varied communities acting with radical care. In October 2020, the Temporary Art Platform, a curatorial project with emphasis on the Global South, presented Make Yourself at Home, Radical Care and Hospitality, a program conceived to provide immediate support to artists and cultural practitioners who were impacted by the Beirut port explosion on August 4. It focused on care and hospitality as driving forces for collective solidarity, togetherness, generosity, and hope in the context of the suffocating deadlock we are facing globally. In October 2020, the Body Circus de Rijn organized an extensive series of performances, workshops, lectures, and discussions titled How Do We Care? A series of programs to politicize bodies and alternative concepts of care. As the organizers explain, the program questions the fragility and resistance of bodies in times of pandemic and examines alternative and radical ways of providing care and assistance. In May 2021, the Berlin Biennale announced the appointment of multi-talented artist Kader Attia as artistic director of the 12th iteration. The Biennale's announcement explains that Attia works with the notion of repair, first of objects and physical injuries, and subsequently of individual and societal traumas, and describes the upcoming show as a critical conversation about how to care for the now. In June 2020, the Rouen Group, a collective appointed artistic directors for Documenta 15, announced the topic of Lumbung as the title and theme of the upcoming show. Yes, an impression of the website. The Lumbung is a traditional Indonesian rice burn, according to the description, that stands for the shared use of resources and mutual care. Some people contest that. Some historians have tried to explain that this is perhaps not accurate. Alia must have a better view on this subject matter, probably. So Lumbung is the center of a community whose members care for each other and take responsibility together. This is the fantastic design of the webpage of Documenta 15, with this kind of handwritten element incorporated in the fonts and these sketches of groupings by the curators that have a certain humane aspect, which could consider to discuss perhaps later on. I must say that I feel happy that an intersectional understanding of care has entered the art field so strongly, but I also feel I need to ask myself why such an overwhelming adoption of the theme of care by all sorts of institutional and cultural initiatives is taking place. And how is this idea of the caring institution connected to the way institutions and art projects have portrayed themselves throughout the years of the financial crisis, with notions such as the commons, resilience, the epistemologies of the global south being pivoted in this process of self-discovery. I think we'll fail to assess this process if we miss this specific shift in the discourse of the institution, the curatorial, the art initiative. In the texts that I previously quoted, I sense this turn from the civil institution, the union, the party, the state, the labor organigram, let's say, towards one another, towards ourselves as individual agents, humans, abandoned in this deregulated havoc. We have each other, the Iflux book tells us. And it is in this shift in discourse that I see a recurrence of a certain humanism that I have to admit that it troubles me a bit. In this shift to one another, the appeal to the party, the state, the parliament is not entirely obfuscated, but rather substituted with an appeal to the art institution or the art project as that big other that replaces and salvages all discredited social institutions of our recent past. Practicing and teaching care ceases to simply pertain to a strategic social process, but relies on this innate human goodness of oneself or of ethically aligned communities. Today, I want to share with you the hypothesis that this appeal to goodness does not necessarily help art's emancipatory agenda, since it quite often overlooks the diverse dependencies of peripheral and precarious institutions, imposing itself as a universal virtue, goodness, or community or togetherness, or having each other does not immediately foster the progressive restructuring of dislocated social spheres. And this is perhaps a lesson from Athens. And I'll try to showcase some activities, or some antinomies of goodness, of this notion of goodness, as explored by the activities of the Athenian art scene between 2016 and 2018, through acts undertaken by people who started feeling at odds with this innate goodness impersonated by global art institutions in specific. So these activities attempted to thematize the possible shortcomings of humanist discourse. And most of these experiments were hosted by the Athens Biennale, testifying for the shape-shifting character of an institution that has felt the pressure of international spotlight since its fourth iteration, the awarded 2013 Agora exhibition. This is a moment, I hope you can see it, a moment from Agora. The Beggars Opera is the group that performs in the spotlight of Agora. Omonia, the fifth Athens Biennale, following the Agora experiment, was supposed to unfurl as a process-based event that would aggregate itself to the 2017 Documenta 14 exhibition at both Athens and Kassel. Alas, the marriage between Documenta 14 and Athens Biennale was unsuccessful. leaving the Biennale's institution defunded, disenfranchised, and certainly drained of its human resources. An event that played out as a strange prognosis of this demise was the so-called Puerto Rico project, the opening of the Nick Boricua Museum. The project was part of the 5th Athens Biennale, and it was a large-scale collective exercise in parafiction designed and scripted by Alexis Fitezis, Panos Klavenitis, and myself, and consisted in Marcel Brotaire's style of ceremonial opening of a museum for a single evening. The museum showcased the life of Nikias Fokas, or Nick Boricua, a hero of the 1820s Greek War of Independence, but also a Spanish courtier in the Dorado region of Puerto Rico, and eventually instigator of the anti-colonial struggle of the Puerto Rican natives. The figure was a parafictional invention inspired by Wolfgang Schäuble's public joke to exchange Greece's Eurozone membership with Puerto Rico's. The event sought to syncretize Greece as Puerto Rico, crafting a more exotic and more appealing version of contemporary Greece. More than 20 artists were brought together to script this parafictional event. Once the divorce between the Athens Biennale and the Documenta 14 was official and irreversible, the Athens Biennale decided to organize an independent program that would run synchronously to the opening of the Documenta 14 in Athens. Various artists and curators were summoned to form the Heart and Sword division, curatorial band responsible for an urgent spin exhibition of the Biennale titled Waiting for the Barbarians, a mimetic reworking of Documenta's leitmotif of indigenous resistance against neoliberalism. The program kicked off with the circulation of photos, such as this one, depicting the curators in black, resembling 19th century Peloponnesian pirates or Cretan farmers, spiced up with tech accessories and other type of accessories. The photo shoot took place on the rooftop of both the Biennales and the Documenta's headquarters in Athens. They shared the same building back then. So this picture is on the top of the headquarters of Documenta 14 in Athens. In Waiting for the Barbarians, curators and artists would impersonate the barbarians, the noble savages, the imperiled and romanticized indigeneities that global souls seek for in the insurgent global south. This self-ridicule was a response to a gaze that did not merely orientalize some of us, but also humanized us, portraying the Greeks as remnants of some resistant humanity. Of course, these acts were meant to show that we are not necessarily good. In this quite niche press conference, the team role-played the barbarians, improvising on themes of authenticity, anti-capitalism, digital alienation, return to origins, and so on. The act was an homage to Laibach, and especially to the infamous 1983 TV Tednik interview in which Laibach tests the reflexes of the state and the police. And I guess that this is a rather popular moment here. Lots of people know about it. In a similar fashion, the Biennale presented the Klassenfahrt project, an educational trip by a multinational team of artists. As Documenta 14 had summoned cultural travelers from all around the world, the proxy travel agency Blue Owl Travels advertised an alternative guided tour. A bus by the fake agency Blue Owl Travels kidnapped the visitors of Documenta 14 and drove them to a semi-rural outskirt of Athens to encounter a small village inhabited by exotic indigeneity, such as Mexican Satanists, Balkan Indians, art teachers, black magicians, pink gorillas, and tennis coaches. Revisiting the primitivist legacy, Klassenfahrt sought to revamp a boring suburb of Attica into a post-apocalyptic Pont-Aven. But to explain how this force of goodness operates, I have to focus a bit on the responses to the 6th Athens Biennale. By early 2018, the Biennale had managed to secure resources to have its 6th iteration. Anti, the 6th Athens Biennale, sought to map the ways in which anti was being mainstreamed in politics, ideology, and cultural industry at the time. The show would focus on the figure of the contrarian in digital culture, popular culture, the music industry, and in politics, drawing on a decade's experience of financial and political crisis. Hosting more than 100 artists, the Biennale employed both earnest and mimetic strategies to examine the versioning of anti. I think that the international reception of the show was typical of the way goodness operates as an artistic ideology today. Press and critics either praised the show as a successful dystopian critique of the digital swamp, or dismissed its strategies, highlighting the danger of mimetic contagion when you approach too close to phenomena such as the alt-right or the nihilistic stream of online trolling. In a patronizing style, hyper-allergic, wrote in regard to the show that exhibitions that continue to employ such tactics end up making use of semiotic sabotage that threatens the humanistic foundations upon which progressive movements have been working towards for decades. In such universalizing appeals to humanity and to humanistic foundations, I fail to see anything really progressive, but I rather sense a strongly reactionary element in contemporary culture, namely the ideology of hope punk, if you know what I mean, this digital and cinematic trend that adores hope, dignity, softness, communal care, wholesomeness and kindness as postulates of some inner humanity and nobility. And to finish this, let me mention a wonderful book by philosopher Richard Kraut. The title of his treatise is Against Absolute Goodness and inspires the title of my presentation today. In this book, Kraut suggests that there is something morally objectionable in seeing everything and every person as a locus of absolute value or as a means to increasing such value. Kraut suggests that people should not be treated as vessels in which an impersonal goodness is to be fostered. And I think that this suggestion is very relevant to the topic of the old and the new cosmopolitanism that this panel and this conference discusses today. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Kostis. This was really interesting. So yeah, welcome back, Alia. Yeah, I'm happy to be with both of you here for the discussion. And I prepared some questions because I kind of knew some things you were talking about, but now I made some new notes. So I would like to start with you, Kostis, because you just spoke. Sorry, you don't have time to breathe. But so you were talking a lot about care, like also this inflationary use of care, also this language. I had to think of this meme that maybe some of you know. You see like a paradise with people of different races, and they're cuddling with tigers and koala bears, and the caption says, the world if people treated each other like they do by email. So you maybe know like this very wonderful language of care in emails, but then the reality in lots of institutions for cultural workers is very different. So it also made me think of a text that is called What If We Didn't Care by two cultural workers and art mediators, Esther Poppe and Arotin Mirsahani. So my question is from their text actually, and they are asking the question, what does care look like in a position of power, like an art institution, for example, and also the other way around, what does care look like when you are not in a position of power? Thinking of maybe someone who works at the museum as a guide or as a guard. So this is my question to you.
All right. Well, my interest in this kind of overwhelming adoption of the notion of care by all kinds of initiatives, institutions, anti-institutions or projects or radical projects, mainstream projects, and everything in between, is what that popularization of the notion brings about. Of course, I mean, I do understand that there's always, I mean, care should be conceived and discussed in relation to power or the lack of power, but I do feel that when it is abstracted and when it becomes some sort of an abstract universal, it exactly misses this distributive aspect that always encompasses any understanding of care. But it's not about care in specific. It's also about the notion of commonality, of community, of togetherness that tends to be mentioned repetitively in the discourse of institutions for quite some time, for at least a decade or more. My critical insinuations just want to bring in some reflections from how we did experience that phenomenon in Greece. Because this kind of super egotic idea of the caring institution is the way that big global institutions and smaller radical initiatives have been approaching Greece and the Greeks throughout this financial crisis, through a certain performance of care and humanistic orientation and attitude. And this is what generates a certain suspicion, because not so much because of this, of let's say, the failure of care, but because of what care obscures as a universalist idea. The fact that there are many discrepancies, there are many financial problems that are not, that remain unaddressed, labor problems, and actual problems that pertain to the actual creativity and the access to the very radicalist notions that are discussed globally. This is an uneven process. And I just feel that whenever we use such terms as kind of universals, we miss that element of, or we impose some kind of virtue that cannot be met by the subjects that are supposed to impersonate it. So this is the deficiency that I'm trying to sketch out in this presentation. But I'm very open to objections or other takes on that, and happy to discuss that in length.
Can I comment?
Yes,
on
of
your
course.
questions?
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting because when you put the lumbung in as part of your presentation, I think, and how it relates to the universalism of the words care today in the contemporary art practice. I remember also a few years ago we have this another term of this new universalism is common. Suddenly, common, like the common, like suddenly like everybody used the term common. So I think it's quite interesting for me, like working and practicing in the part of the world that is everything still part of our everyday life, like carrying the common. It's something that you do in your everyday life. It's not being performed, you know. I think one problem of this term when it comes as distributed as a global art discourse in how it becomes being performed. So it's a performative care or more like performative common instead of what we really do as common or as a care. I think in a way I agree with your criticality towards how this term being distributed globally, because I feel like I appreciate the ruang rupa using lumbung because then it gives you another imagination of the idea of how care being practicing in other part of the world. It's in our reality, it's still part of our everyday life. Like in Indonesia, almost every Sunday, the fathers, like people who lives in the community, in the village area or rural area, they have to be part of this working together. Either you fix the road, you fix the small river for the water during the rainy season. So like almost every Sunday you have to work for the community, and it's part of the social engage in natural way, not being constructed by art projects, not being constructed by this curatorial imagination, but it's just the way they live. So I think one of my criticality on how the Western production of knowledge is how this term being interfere to the local situation, and they are being seen as the new concept instead of really realizing what actually happen every day as part of their life. So this is like, I think, yeah, I still have to think about how to build the bridge between like the use of actually the goodness. I like also how you refer this as a goodness. Somehow they recognize the new wisdom, the othering, like othering wisdom of social practice is like common, and care is they got the inspiration or they got the wisdom from other part of the world, like in the global south. But then it's being co-opted in the system of Western knowledge production. Then in a way you lost the sense of its rootness to the local community. So I think this is the problem of how the production of knowledge being institutionalized by the Western, but rather than being distributed to the local practitioners. So yeah, for me it's quite interesting to look into the next documenta to see what happens, because they are kind of like collecting all the different practices around the world on the idea of collective care and community, but then how to bring the local situated knowledge in one European place, and also with the umbrella of the burden of the history of documenta itself.
Thank you to both of you. I was going to ask you a question that you kind of already answered now, because, yeah, I mean, thinking of this care as you said, there's this thing that is performed by institutions maybe, but then there's also this difference in actually as a verb, just caring, being practical. And as an art mediator, for me, the practicality is really important. It's not just a theory. It's like, how can I translate this into talking to people? So, yeah, that would be maybe another question for both of you, or whoever wants to answer. How can you make this caring as a verb, as actually being practical, doing actions, how can you make this concrete in dealing with an audience or an exhibition or as your curatorial work?
Can I mention a concrete example, if I may? Because Alia wonderfully described this kind of institutionalization process of ideas such as care or the commons, which are very nice and radical and benevolent stuff we should be talking about, and nobody rejects them or dismisses any of this stuff. I mean, I really tend to listen carefully to the discussion itself. But back in late 2018 or early 2019, I collaborated with a big cultural institution in Athens to curate an exhibition on post-digitality and kind of post-digital trends in the Greek cultural scene. And after a year or so, I thought I want to follow up and do a second event on the same topic, but with a new, let's say, dimension and aspect. And then, so I've met with the new director of this institution. I'm not going to name it anyway. And I asked, should we proceed with to the second phase of this project? And the reply was, why don't you do something with immigrants? I said, because I believe that, people like Ai Weiwei can do it better. I can't steal his job. He has a better way to do that, so I can't really make any sense of that. But anyway, this is typical of how agendas and also funds and stipends are moving across the field, and how a certain value is produced by the circulation, the simple circulation of this notion. Yes, so if I can answer your question, it's very difficult for me to find a space to act with care, since I may put it this way. I don't think that curating is completely identical to care. Curating can also be a process of uncaring, of showing less care to certain things in order to expose something that is happening. And this is not just a critical position. It can also be a performative position that entangles you within the very symptoms you are discussing. And I think that's fine. That's something we should still seek for and make space for. Yeah, I don't know if that's an answer, but anyway, I hope.
But that's one is very provocative, yeah, like curating as uncare.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe Alia, maybe you want to also add something. So the question was kind of, just to repeat it, how can you make care as like a verb, caring? How can you make this practical in your curatorial practice, for example?
Yeah, I think working as a curator in the area where we don't really have the institutions for curatorial art education, I think only 2 years ago in one university in Indonesia, they opened curatorial and art history department. So this is like something that is very new in the academic system. It's always like an autopilot movement. As a curator, you really have to think of how you position yourself in more like, in a way it's spontaneous, but and other way it's a subjective positions. And I think the strength of subjectivity become very vital when you work in more, I don't say that in Indonesia we don't really have infrastructure, but it's more non-hierarchical art systems where everything, as I mentioned, there is no museum, no institutions, no big curator. So everything is just kind of like equal, but then you don't really have the map to navigate. Yeah. So it's, I think, quite interesting way of working. So when we talk about care or how we put our social engagement in the language of the global art institutions, that become very, in a way, problematic, but in another way, it gives you the possibility to articulate your positions. Like for me, for example, I don't feel like I have all the time to show the social engage in my exhibition, because it happens in my everyday life, you know? Like I live in the middle of village and everybody is sharing, everybody is, now I'm developing a space where I invite artists to stay with farmers and local residents, and then they create works for the residents, and then when we have presentation or exhibition, it was like all the farmers and all our neighbors came to see the exhibition. So the project is not made for the art world, the project is for the local community themselves. But I don't want to transfer this practice into the global international language, because then you felt like you follow their agenda. So that's always be one of the problematic situations. So I think my position as a curator, either I work in the institution as Biennale or I have my own project as curator, I always think that the first, the first positions that I have to stand with is how I look the project in the local situation, how they benefit the community, how they benefit the real people who support them, instead of pleasing the agenda of the institutions and the funding and, you know, international language. I think we try to avoid these performative actions of care. I agree that it's a verb, so I feel like if you do something that somehow mimicry or you adopt the practice of everyday life, you really have to give the credit to the people who really do that every day, instead claiming that as an art project. I think this was happen like very often, like when you have artist residency from the international circle coming to Indonesia, coming to other part of the world, and they created something, then it's become part of the art instead of part of the daily life. And also then it's the idea being owned by the artists or the curators, rather than becoming the echo or the vibrant life of the people who really does that. So I think the Biennale and my curatorial projects trying to look the term, all the international participatory, social engage, commons, care, more in the local situation. We don't really use that statements in many of our texts. We try to avoid similarities to other contexts, but we understand that we do the same. When you don't mention that in the same language, it doesn't mean that you don't do that, but you do that in your own way, in the local situations.
Thank you so much to both of you. We have a little bit more time, so I would like to ask if there are questions in the audience or maybe online. I don't know how we can see if there's stuff online, but nothing. Okay. What does the time say? Okay. So thank you for this discussion. This was really interesting. We'll have a short break. We'll be back in 10 minutes. We can have a coffee or tea. And yeah, thanks for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sami.